Hello, this is Alan Wheeler with another online lecture for English 1102, Literature and Composition, the online course I'm teaching. Today we'll be talking about a concept called showing versus telling and looking at the short story A&P by John Updike to look at this approach or this element of literature. By way of introduction, I want to look at something in Chapter 1 of the Kennedy Literature Textbook. This is on page 15 in the section under the bold headline, The Short Story. And here, the textbook editors give a comparison, contrast between tales and short stories. And they write that the teller of tales relies heavily on the method of summary, terse, general narration. On the other hand, they write that in a short story, a form more realistic than the tale and of modern origin, in which the writer usually presents the main events in greater fullness. So the editors go on to describe how writers of short stories are skilled in rendering a scene, a vivid or dramatic moment, and developing characters that are either dynamic and changing or well-rounded characters. And other differences they go into, but the one we're concentrating on is this idea of showing rather than telling. And whereas in a tale, which is more terse, there'll be more telling even of the moral or theme of the story sometimes. And modern short story writers avoid long summary and try to show rather than to tell. Here is some advice from Mark Twain. He gave this advice to authors, and Mark Twain wrote, "Don't say the old lady screamed, bring her on and let her scream." And by this I think he means that it's better to dramatize and bring the scene to life rather than telling the reader, rather than saying the character cried. Talk about the shortness of breath and tears and other things that dramatize the situation. From a handbook to literature, this concept, showing versus telling, is called an empirical concept, an unsophisticated but still useful idea that emphasizes the superiority of dramatization, demonstration, enactment, and embodiment over mere telling. So there's an example in Hemingway's novel To Have and Have Not. He could have written something rather abstract. He could have written "shots were fired," which would be telling what happened. But rather, Hemingway chose instead to make us see and hear this scene, to dramatize this scene. And here's what he wrote. "The first thing, a pane of glass went, and the bullet smashed into a row of bottles on the showcase wall to the right. I heard the gun going, and pop, 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 pop. There were bottles smashing all along the wall." So you can see the difference. So we'll be looking at this idea that in modern short stories and other literature, showing is given a higher priority and value than telling what happens. And we'll look at the short story A&P by John Updike and look at it in three ways. One, in rendering a scene rather than just giving a bare plot summary, as I just gave you an example from Hemingway. And two, developing characters, showing rather than telling. perhaps rather than saying that he was a gallant knight, as in a tale, letting the character, by dialogue and actions, by the tone, by the reactions of other characters, developing and showing that character. And finally, looking at how the theme itself is often more given as an experience than a verbalized or easily articulated moral or lesson. So we'll look at those three things in A&P. And to begin with, this idea of showing a scene, rendering a scene. And you could almost close your eyes, flip through the pages, and put your finger down at any random spot and find an example of how Updike renders a scene rather than telling us exactly. And so I'll run through the story, some examples I've highlighted, but again, there are so many, we don't have time. And in the face-to-face class, many of the students brought out some of these examples. Starting at the beginning of the story, we know from the title, it's not just a supermarket, it's an A&P. We know the narrator is in the third checkout slot. He sees the three girls walk in. When they're over by the bread, he stands there with a box of Hi-Ho crackers in his hand, and he rings it up. So immediately, familiar scenery there. And going on through this, another example in paragraph 5. He watches as all three of the girls go up, and he calls it the cat and dog food, breakfast cereal, macaroni, rice, raisin, seasoning, spread, spaghetti, soft drinks, crackers, and cookies aisle. So again, very specific scene there that we can all recognize in a supermarket. He describes very specifically the cool of the A&P under the fluorescent lights against all those stacked packages, the three girls walking. He describes the checkerboard green and cream rubber tile floor. In paragraph 10, the narrator describes the town itself and helping us to understand even the social dynamics in the story by showing us that the town is 5 miles from a beach. He tells us, right in the middle of town, where women generally put on a shirt or shorts, and rather than just only telling us that people don't wear bathing suits, especially two-piece bathing suits in this environment, he tells us that they're in the middle of town. You can see 2 banks and the Congregational Church and the newspaper store and 3 real estate offices and so on. And he goes on to say there's people in this town that haven't seen the ocean for 20 years, even though they're 5 miles from the beach. So that explains some of what's happening in the story for us. Just some other examples. As he describes the store, he talks about the light bulb section, the records at discount, and the 6-packs of candy bars and plastic toys done up in cellophane. And so we get specific pictures, and I'll save a few of these because often, as in the case with the location of the A&P store, the scene also tells us other things, or shows us other things, I should say. Let's go on to the second idea, though, that rather than telling us what the character, the qualities of the character. Updike shows us by giving us the first person point of view, and by giving us the perspective and the attitudes and the words and actions of Sammy, his main character, who's fully developed. And we get one of the things that students in the face-to-face class noticed right away was that it's very realistic. We get a very realistic perspective of a 19-year-old guy. And so whole paragraphs are spent describing the girls, and we know his response to them. For example, at the end of paragraph 3, after he's describing these girls in bathing suits, the narrator comments, "I mean, it was more than pretty." And some of the students pointed out other places where he describes and spends a lot of time with the perspective of a teenage guy. And let's see if I can find another one here quickly. When one of the girls pulls the money from the top of her bathing suit, he comments, "Really, I thought that was so cute," and how the jar went heavy in his hand. So we get a lot of ideas of the perspective of a 19-year-old guy, but we get more than that, I think. That we don't get a flat character. We also see a comic side to Sammy, and we see social commentary that he makes and how he thinks and reacts as the story goes on. He, some of the students in the face-to-face class pointed out his humor in almost like a stand-up comic, saying that the older woman in the first paragraph had probably been watching cash registers 40 years and never seen a mistake before. That if she'd been born at the right time, going on into paragraph 2, they would have burned her over in Salem. And much of his commentary is comic, either sarcastic, ironic, or funny in the perceptions he gives. One more example in paragraph 9. This would be on page 18 if you're looking in the literature book. And he makes a joke about his co-worker Stokesy, who comes back to himself and says, "Is it done?" He asks, the responsible married man finding his voice. And Sammy tells us, "I forgot to say he thinks he's going to be manager some sunny day, maybe in 1990 when it's called the Great Alexandrov and Pestrosky Tea Company or something." So he's making a joke that would have been more relevant in the time period this is written, about the Cold War, but really good comedy material there, especially back in 1961. So we see these sides of Sammy. We see also that he's very perceptive, and all of these details that he notices, and his social commentary, calling the shoppers sheep in several places. In paragraph 5, for example, Sammy writes, "The sheep pushing their carts down the aisle. The girls were walking against the usual traffic. Not that we have one-way signs or anything." So here we see his social comment coupled with his humor, coupled with the perspective of a 19-year-old guy, and some of his idealism, and many, many examples that you could find throughout the story. Let's go on as the time is running quickly here, and go on to the third point, because I think you could find many examples of characterization and the rendering of scenes. But let's go on to the third point, which is the theme. And we have to be a little careful with modern short stories, I think. I'm going to look at page 21 in the textbook. This is actually following the short story A&P. And there's an excerpt from John Updike on writing. And he's talking on the topic of why write. And near the end of this little excerpt, John Updike makes these comments. And he's talking about the purpose of writing. And he says that the writer's proper activity is to produce something, and what he produces, John Updike says here, what he makes is ideally as ambiguous and opaque as life itself. So this is very different from the fable in which we have a moral clearly stated. This is very different from the fairy tale, in which good and evil are clearly displayed often. And so Updike is saying that the theme is complex, like life, not always clear. And so for many modern writers, the theme is more of a full experience, perhaps, of the human condition or some issues and tensions in life. So we have to be careful, I think, in stating a theme, but meaning is hard to avoid, even when your theme is the meaninglessness of life. It's hard to get away from that significance. So the social scene that's set up for us, just by the rendering of the scene, brings some significance. The fact that this story is character-centered, and we get the revelation of a round character and a change in a dynamic character, give us significance. What I think we should be careful about is saying something like, the theme of this story is to stick to your guns, to stand up for your convictions. Although Sammy does do that, that may be too simplistic in this case. Another one that might be too simple is, be careful or you might lose your job over idealism. While that does happen in the story, that might be too simplistic. Again, supermarket society is hypocritical. That would be an overt statement. Or people are like sheep. Or to claim that the story is a Marxist look at social inequality and injustice. I think most of those would be something that might be woven into the experience of theme in the story, but maybe too simple, and maybe just a part of that. So, knowing that it's probably character-centered and that we're being shown this experience, we might consider what happens in the story to this character and what significance or issues arise. And I think we see this at the end of the story. We see that something has happened. We know that Sammy writes that, or says that his stomach kind of fell as he felt how hard the world was going to be to him hereafter. And he, just a paragraph earlier, when Lingle, the manager, has told him, you'll feel this for the rest of your life, Sammy knows that that's true. So something has happened, and probably we're being shown rather than told that Sammy's coming of age. He's growing up. He's seeing something of life in the adult world. And some clues to this, I think, near the end of the second to last, the penultimate paragraph, Sammy says that he's in his white shirt that his mother ironed the night before. So we know that he's in childhood, maybe emerging from childhood, as the door heaves itself open and outside the sunshine, he writes, is skating around on the asphalt. So there may be a kind of awakening. And what does Sammy learn? Maybe we could ask that. The experience of growing up, for one thing, seems to be rich and complex, not easy to put into words, better put into this whole experience of a short story. Does he learn that it's costly to stand up for convictions? Perhaps. We know that's true from the plot. Idealism, could it be that idealism is not always rewarded, as in fairy tales and in more romantic notions? That's possible. And we can think about, what is the narrator's attitude? What is Sammy's attitude about what happens to him? He takes it very seriously. He doesn't make a big joke of this in the end. What is the author's attitude just by spending this amount of time to create this short story? Where might his sympathies lie? What might he be saying? And again, it's probably a complex mixture of issues and emotions, but there does seem to be, if not an epiphany or revelation, at least a growing up. Sometimes these have been called stories of initiation. Another example would be Araby by James Joyce, in which the main character's romantic notions are shattered somewhat, and he's disillusioned at the end of that story by James Joyce. And romantic notions seem a little crushed, and there seems to be an end of childhood in some ways, or idealism, at least in some ways. So we are shown this theme through almost the anticlimactic, anti-heroic ending of this story, when Sammy comes out and he looks around for the girls and they're gone. He looks at Lingle, whose back is stiff as if he just had an injection of iron, and Sammy's stomach falls. So we get this experience, and we are shown this experience rather than told a neat little lesson or a neat little moral. So this brings us to the end of these three ways of looking at showing versus telling. And I hope you could apply this to other stories that we read. And always pulling out details to make your point, and pulling out pieces of the text, phrases, images, examples from the text to support your ideas are always going to be effective in writing about literature. So thank you for listening.